Could you, for the folks watching or listening, can you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background of how you came to be involved in the work you're doing now?
Sure. So I'm gonna introduce myself in our language, which is Dwalashutsi. Oti Gwelapu, Hafdi Siaya, Hafdi Ishid, Hagalitsa Sistad, Swaraps Chud, Visayan Chud, uh, Hoth Datitude. So greetings, my friends and relatives. My ancestral name is Hagalitsa. I am Swinomish and I'm Visayan. And so, good morning. I'm happy to be here. Uh, you asked me to just share a little bit about my background. I am a peacemaker. I have been formally trained by Indian Dispute Resolution Services out of Davis and Sacramento, California, back in the 90s. And then before that, I was trained by San Francisco Community Boards program at the suggestion and recommendation of my mother, who is also a peacemaker. And at that time, she was working with a group out here in Washington called the Northwest Intertribal Court System. And at that time, the the Judge Kuchaisi, was wanting to bring peacemaking and mediation kind of work into tribal communities. So they work with 14 different tribes to get them trained up on peacemaking skills. And so I went into that world of peacemaking because my mother said that that's what our communities needed. And at that time, I was in an undergraduate and I was just trying to figure out what to do. So while I was getting my undergraduate um, it was basically in liberal arts with an emphasis on ethnic studies. I was also taking this peacemaking training, and it has been very transformative, as a young person, and I use it still today. These peacemaking skills, and I find that oftentimes we don't get the opportunity to share who we are and to touch each other's heart through a peacemaking model, because we've learned so much in the public school system how to be so competitive and how to win in any given situation. And for peacemaking, it really requires relationship building and a deeper understanding of who we are if we're going to care for one another and if we're going to care for the earth. And at the heels of my formal training, I cut my teeth as a peacemaker with two organizations, the Indigenous Women's Network and the Indigenous Environmental Network. And that's where I was not only training organizers throughout Indian country, because that's the service area that both organizations was serving. Indigenous Women's Network at that time was international, and the Indigenous Environmental Network at that time was pretty much national. It's grown up and it's gone national. But at that time, I was working with both organizations, and I was actually teaching peacemaking and conflict resolution. And I was actually doing a lot of mediation internally and with our partner organizations like Greenpeace, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And there's strong relationship with those organizations and Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace and those folks. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's been a relationships that we've been trying to nurture and grow. But we find with every generation, there's a need to decolonize and to inform people about what it means to work in Indigenous communities if that community is on a front line, just trying to protect what is sacred, or their water or the air or the land that they have to live on. And the thing is that I marry the work of the peacemaker with the work of environmental activists. So I was in the Indigenous Environmental Network. I not only was doing that conflict resolution and facilitating a lot of conversations often very difficult because people were not on the same page. But the good thing is that people ultimately came together, since we have had to service many different tribal communities throughout the country
Mhm.
on some pretty big issues, whether it was nuclear waste and the cleanup issues or persistent organic pollutants, all these things that were happening across the country with not only indigenous communities, but communities of color, because oftentimes those communities are redlined into places that are pretty toxic, the environment, I mean. And so that work has strengthened my ability as an educator and as a peacemaker to bring those lessons home. So I work with our Swinomish tribal community at present as a consultant with our organization, which is the Community Engagement and Peacemaking Project. So I started that, I co-founded that with my mother and some other folks that we were able to work with throughout the years, or who went through our training program and became trainers themselves. And so it's been a wonderful experience working with my mother in my own community. We are working on the Climate Change Resilience Grant, which is a project of the Swinomish tribe. We are part of what we call the Protect Mother Earth Subcommittee that reports to the Department of Environmental Protection, which is the name of the department that the grant is run through. And so our work is centered on lifting our language, our Dwalashutsi language, and teaching that to our young ones and families, with the hope that we will remember those old ancient stories and the terminology, the words, the phrases that connect us to the earth, that is our sacred obligation to protect and to ensure that we are all thriving in a way that is healthy and in a manner that is centered on wellness. And it's only because we've, as indigenous people, have had to survive many traumas throughout the years, you know with smallpox during the initial colonization process, with new laws and new governing systems that were imposed upon us, using things like Robert's Rules of Order. And I was trained by a lot of elders and peacemakers that, consensus is more appropriate manner, with the tree of peace over there, the great tree of peace that the tribes over in the New York area, that would be the Oneidas and the Senecas, and many of the tribes that were from that area, created a way of decision making that was very inclusive of all of those tribal groupings and families. And whenever there was a disagreement or a wrongdoing, they would gather together under a tree, and that became known as the Tree of Peace. And coincidentally, I should mention that the way that the U.S. government governing system has been structured, it follows that model. And if you think of the United Nations, for example, another entity that kind of uses that same model, where you gather all the nations together and you sort of go around in a circle to talk about the important matters that need to be talked about, and to discuss what is going to be the appropriate way to handle these wrongdoings, or these misunderstandings, or these conflicts. And so that work has followed me throughout the years. I continue to do that in my facilitation of strategic planning processes whenever there's new and different ways of doing things. And as we've been very impacted by this COVID-19 virus, there has been a great need for us as humans to change our behavior. And when you're doing that, it kind of causes a little conflict, because it's a different way of knowing and being that we may not know how to adapt just yet. So there's going to be that tension. There may be some misunderstanding and disagreements about how to move forward, really. Like, did we reach herd immunity? Our, medical advisors and experts are telling us that we need to change our behavior if we're going to survive. And I think the ancient language and the teachings within that are embedded in the language that connects us to the earth are the same thing, like the CDC was trying to do when COVID came around. And, there were a lot of losses because people didn't really believe the virus even was real. Just like there's a lot of people that don't want to believe that the climate crisis is real. And so I see a lot of young ones stepping up and like getting very concerned about why the adults aren't treating this like a crisis. And I just have to say that I'm really excited about this work. So we as the Protect Mother Earth Subcommittee under the Department of Environmental Protection at Swinomish is very, very dedicated at this point to raising awareness about the impacts and also about our ability to adapt, our ability to think creatively and coherently about the way forward. And a lot of us are of the same mind that the foundation of that work must be the language and place knowledge, also known as place-based knowledge in academia. And so that's what brings me here. That's a little bit about my background. I've always strived to protect the earth because I was raised in a family where my father was a farmer. He was a gardener. He was raised on a farm camp in Waipahu, Hawaii. So the Visayan part of me is that connection. I still have a lot of relatives in Hawaii. And our people here at Swinomish, we are farmers of the sea. And so the saying is, when the tide is out, the table is set. And it's looking very grim for the salmon. And we Swidops, we are people of the salmon. We are people by the water. Our elders have always said that throughout the generations. And so here we are today, and this situation is looking very bleak for the salmon, which is another indicator species for us, because all our ceremonies are centered around what gives us sustenance, like the salmon and the cedar. And so, it is, I feel, a responsibility more so than a right to hunt, fish, and gather in our usual and accustomed places, which is an article in our treaty of 1855, Point Elliott Treaty. That article number 5 says that we have the right to hunt, fish, and gather in our usual and accustomed places. And my question when I am in front of a group or a class or a workshop that's being facilitated is that possible, given the grim circumstances of the salmon today? Because
Can you give us an understanding of why it's so grim? Like some of the specific impacts that have occurred that are not benefiting the ecosystem or the salmon or other species?
They're not able to return back up the river. There's 3 dams on the Skagit River, upriver. There are the warming of the waters. We're seeing a lot of eagles not even go halfway up the river anymore. Why? Because there's nothing up there for them to eat because they feed off the salmon at certain times of the year. And so our fisher folks, we used to be able to fish for weeks, and now it's just maybe a couple days if we're lucky, or a few days. And so that's a huge impact on our ecosystem and the food source, one of the food sources that we rely on.
You were saying that the eagles are not going up the Skagit River as they used to do. And what does that indicate to you?
So that just indicates that because the salmon are not returning up the river like they once were, when there was abundance of salmon going upriver. Again, there 3 dams that are on the Skagit River. The eagles are not flying upriver. They're staying lowland. They're staying more in the valley area where there are still salmon returning, but when they can't swim upriver, they can't spawn in their usual spawning grounds, and so hence the diminishing of the numbers of salmon. And there's different species of salmon that swim up that river. We have the fortune of having the great wealth of 5 species of salmon in one river, the Skagit River. And so that river is very precious to us. And again, the salmon is our sustenance, our Swatops. People are people of the salmon. We are people by the water. Our reservation is surrounded by water. And there's a lot of inundation and a lot of warming that's happening where we have to figure out how we're going to adapt through food sovereignty programs like our clam bed, growing our clam gardens so that our clam beds can be more fruitful and perhaps survive in these kind of conditions with a little help from our science folks and our community folks to help mitigate and create an environment where the clams will thrive and not go away from us. And so we're studying, the tribe has studied the different kind of the different kind of clam garden beds and operations up in our relatives in the British Columbia area, where there are tribes that are doing that. They're growing clam gardens and they're seemingly thriving. So we have a lot to learn from each other. We have a lot of work to do. Another example is, what we're seeing evidence of this climate crisis is the forest fires, the rampant wildfires that are crossing the state of Washington even. And as I watch the news and I look at the maps of where all these fires are, most of the state of Washington has been on fire this year. I mean, half the country was on fire last year. So, the evidence is clear that when that happens, it changes your ecosystem. And we don't know what the fallout is yet, the long-term effects. We're studying it. We don't know how fast and hard the climate crisis really is going to impact, but we're seeing it happening faster than predicted. And so I'm very, very much concerned about the future and our survival in terms of feeding what we call feeding our Indian. That's access to our traditional food sources. We have a reservation that has boundaries, and there's certain 10 miles by 7 miles of reservation land, but we have our usual and custom places that we get the right to hunt, fish, and gather in. It's in our, again, treaty, 1855 Point Elliott Treaty in Article 5. It says that we have the right to hunt, fish, and gather in our usual and accustomed places. And my question, is that possible? If we have usual and accustomed places that span way beyond the reservation boundaries, up to the mountains and down south to Snohomish and up as far as the border of Whatcom County and the northern part of Whidbey Island, that's a pretty big expansive area. That's like 4 counties I just described. But anyway, our usual and custom places are far reaching, and that's where we hunt and gather things. And so that's where other tribes, our neighboring tribes, do the same, because they have their usual and accustomed places. And so our treaty right says that, but that doesn't mean that's going to happen given the climate crises. And so a lot of tribes who, again, are the indicator species because they live off the earth, they live off the water. We are farmers of the sea. Some of us are farmers of the land. I'm seeing folks like the White Earth Land Recovery Project and Honor the Earth. They're buying back land. They're growing hemp. Hemp mitigates the toxins in the earth. I mean, there's all kinds of creative ways that we could look at how we're going to survive, how our future is going to thrive and survive. Perhaps we're at that point where we have to really make a concerted effort and we can't do it alone. Our studies show that our small reservation, our small Swinomish Indian tribal community um, will not be able, we don't have the capacity to do it alone. We need our neighbors, and our neighbors need us, because the tide surge is not going to stop at, only impacting the reservation boundaries. As a matter of fact, the town of LaConner will be more severely impacted than our reservation. So we need each
Hmm.
other. The thing is that transportation will be cut off between the reservation and where LaConner is. So if the means is far beyond the scope of what our tribe has the capacity for, it's obvious that we need each other. We need the county, we need the townships surrounding us, we need the the people that live, work, and pray on the reservation land to cooperate and to work with us. We have to strategize together, because frankly we're in it together. And so that's where the peacemaking and conflict resolution skills come into play. That's also where our traditional values and the way of knowing and being on the earth come into play. So when we bring those to the forefront, we perhaps can create a deeper level of understanding and really build relationships in a powerful way that satisfies everyone to some degree as we move forward. And so I really like what these young people are doing when they say take the state to court because of the climate crises, and that they're starting to get more vocal. They're starting to become activists and taking a stand and marching and boycotting, especially in the British Columbia area. And as we see, a lot of their forest is on fire. So it's just an effort that I think as human beings we have the responsibility to do for one another in the future, and also for our relatives that are the two-legged, the four-legged, the winged ones, the ones that we depend on. And so our climate change resilience grant is uh, looking at our language as the foundation for the work, and that the teachings that come out of utilizing the language and the stories that come out when we work with our elders and connect them with our young people that have that energy to affect change, that is at the that those are the foundation of how we move forward. And I think that we all stand to learn from that process, from that model, which is an ancient model. And as I was saying earlier, we've never used Robert's rules necessarily as much as we've come up with processes for building the relationships and an understanding for how we mitigate or how we resolve a conflict like the climate crises.
Hmm. I was thinking about the issues and how they're kind of nested together in the public view and not very clear. For example, we talk about um, climate, we talk about environment, but you're getting to a human rights question and a health question. So
Mhm.
how do they work together, and how does your committee come to an understanding that's broader, and how can that be communicated?
Well, so like any governing system, we do have a health department and we do have an education department, culture department, and we have all these entities like any governing system. In the tribal world, they also have the cultural department that really, is where the language is housed. It's where the knowledge of how we practice, like our salmon homecoming ceremonies. It's a yearly annual thing. The entire community takes part. We invite very important guests that perhaps can help us and maybe have the same vision and mission of bringing the salmon back. And we serve a lunch. Um, our fisheries folks really does a lot of work to be good hosts. And then there's that lunch is followed by a procession. in which is led by our young people, and they bring the bones of the salmon to the water. We pray for the health and safety of the salmon and the fisher folks that are going out to fish, because it is kind of a dangerous occupation. And in that ceremony, we pray that the salmon will return. And we in that way, we're showing honor and respect for something that gives us our sustenance. And that is it's a ceremony. And so we have our traditional foods at ceremonial when we spread the table. Call it spread the table for this meal. We want to be good hosts, and we want to serve our traditional foods. And so it's very reciprocal in that manner. And it's also very, it promotes wellness with our own people, because we get to practice who we are. We get to understand why that's important, and we get to involve our elders and our young people and our entire community while informing and raising awareness with our guests. They could be dignitaries, politicians, they could be educators from the neighboring school, which often, they're often there with classes. And so it's just a community-wide effort. And that's been going on for years, since I was little, I remember. And the other part of it is now with our resilience project, we want to look at how to partner our Department of Environmental Protection, our Protect Mother Earth Subcommittee, with the work that the behavioral health program, it used to be called mental health, but that our behavioral health program is doing when they work on youth suicide prevention. Because we see that some of this work might help develop some confidence and some strategies for young people to perhaps use as an anchor as they move through the challenges of getting an education in a public school that doesn't really recognize who they are and their backgrounds. And so not only do they get to practice who they are, they get to strategize, they get to figure out ways moving forward in the future, given our current impacts. And there's a lot of families that have young people that are helping when they go out crabbing, for example. Right now it's crabbing season. So they get to go out and crab with their families, or they go out on the boat and fish. So that's happening. There's a lot of things to be said about these canoe journey and the canoe races that many families have participated in as a healthy activity. So this project hopes to bring the language into those arenas, working with our young people to pick up the language and also connect with the language to the earth. And so the lessons will be connected to the earth, or perhaps stories of teachings that are ancient that tell us how to behave in the world, that warn us that if we behave a certain way, perhaps we'll have a difficult time. And then it also reminds us of the sacrifices that some characters in the story made so our people today could survive. And so all of that is pretty rich knowledge. And that's what I was saying about, bringing the Lushootseed language and the place knowledge together.